London, 1888. In the crowded, filthy streets of Whitechapel, fear moved faster than the fog. Poverty was everywhere. The alleys were dark, the nights were cold, and survival itself was a daily battle. Men, women, and children packed into cramped lodging houses. Crime, disease, and desperation filled the East End. It was the perfect place for someone to kill and disappear. Then, the murders began. In late August of 1888, a woman named Mary Ann Nichols was found dead in Whitechapel. She had been killed violently. Her body left in the street before dawn. At first, it may have looked like another brutal crime in a district that saw too many. But only days later, another woman, Annie Chapman, was found murdered in a similarly horrifying way. Now it was clear. Something far darker was moving through Whitechapel. The victims were poor women living on the edge of society, many forced into desperate circumstances just to survive. They walked the streets at night because they had few choices, and someone was hunting them. As word spread, panic took hold. The people of Whitechapel were terrified. Women feared walking alone. Men whispered in pubs and on street corners. Newspapers exploded with sensational headlines, turning local murders into a national obsession. The killer was no longer just a murderer. He was becoming a legend of terror. And then came the name. At some point during the investigation, letters began arriving, supposedly sent by the killer. One of them was signed with a name that would echo through history: Jack the Ripper. Whether the letter was real or a cruel hoax, the name stuck. It gave a face to the nightmare, even if no one knew who that face belonged to. Police flooded the streets, but this was an age before fingerprints, DNA, surveillance cameras, or modern forensic science. Officers relied on witness statements, patrols, and instinct. But Whitechapel was a maze of narrow alleys, hidden courtyards, and endless shadows. A killer could strike and vanish in minutes. Then, on the night of September 30th, 1888, the nightmare escalated. 2 women were murdered within hours of each other. London was stunned. Fear became hysteria. The police were under intense pressure. The public wanted blood, answers, and arrests. But the killer remained unseen. He moved like a ghost through the most crowded city on earth, leaving behind bodies, rumors, and terror. And the worst was still to come.
Jack the Ripper, Part 3. Then came the final and most infamous murder. On November 9, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly was found dead in her room in Whitechapel. Unlike the other commonly accepted victims, Kelly was killed indoors, behind a locked door, in a tiny rented room where the killer had time and privacy. For many historians, this murder marked the peak of the Ripper's violence and the moment the case crossed fully from urban terror into legend. Kelly is generally considered the 5th and final member of the canonical 5. Her death shattered whatever hope remained that the killer might be interrupted, driven off, or forced into mistakes. If he could follow a victim into a private room, kill, and still vanish without capture, then nowhere in Whitechapel felt safe. The streets had been frightening enough. Now even walls and locked doors seemed useless. The manhunt intensified, but it produced no arrest, no confession, and no certain identity. That is one reason the case has lasted for more than a century. It ended without a courtroom, without a final confrontation, without the moment where evil is named and punished. The police had suspects, the public had theories, newspapers had endless speculation, but the truth slipped through their hands. Even today, Jack the Ripper remains officially unidentified, and the case is still one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in criminal history. And yet the real tragedy was never the mystery alone. The victims were not myths. They were women living in brutal poverty, moving through a city that offered them little protection and less mercy. Over time, the killer became famous, while the women he murdered were often reduced to footnotes in their own story. But without them, there is no story, only a ghost invented by headlines. By the time the murder stopped, Whitechapel had been permanently marked. The fog, The gaslight, the footsteps in the alley, the newspaper boys shouting extras into the morning air. These became part of one of the darkest legends in modern history. A killer had come out of the East End, murdered at least 5 women in the autumn of 1888, and then disappeared into time, leaving behind only fear, suspicion, and a name that would never die. Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper, Part 4. So who was Jack the Ripper? That question has haunted generations. Over the years, suspects have included doctors, butchers, immigrants, madmen, artists, and even members of the royal circle. Books, documentaries, and amateur detectives have built entire industries around naming the killer. But the honest answer is this: no suspect has been proven. The case remains unsolved, and many theories rely on weak evidence, missing records, or hindsight. Part of what made the murder so enduring was timing. Victorian London was a city of extremes: great wealth beside crushing poverty, imperial confidence beside urban misery. The East End was already seen by many in power as a place of danger and disorder. The murders turned Whitechapel into a symbol of everything the city feared about itself: crime, poverty, vice, and the idea that beneath modern civilization lurked something savage and uncontrollable. The press amplified that fear. The name Jack the Ripper, likely popularized by one of the infamous letters, transformed an unknown killer into a dark celebrity. That name outlived the investigation, outlived the police officers, and even outlived the victims in public memory. The legend became bigger than the evidence. That is why, more than a century later, people still argue over letters, suspects, maps, and witness statements from the autumn of 1888. But maybe the most important truth is not about the killer at all. The Ripper story is often told as a puzzle, but first it was a human disaster. 5 women, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were murdered during a period of terror that exposed just how vulnerable the poor were in Victorian London. Their names should be remembered not because of the man who killed them, but because history too often made him the main character. And that is why the story endures. Not because the mystery was solved, but because it was not. Jack the Ripper became the prototype of the faceless serial killer, unseen, unnamed, and eternally pursued. He left behind no final answer, only a trail of fear through Whitechapel and a warning from the dark beginnings of modern crime. Sometimes history remembers the monster and forgets the people he destroyed.
Jack the Ripper, Part 2. By the end of September 1888, Whitechapel was living under a cloud of fear. The first 2 widely accepted victims, Marianne Nichols and Annie Chapman, had already been killed. Police patrols increased, vigilance committees formed, citizens armed themselves with sticks and suspicion. But fear did not stop the killer. On the night of September 30th, 1888, the terror reached a new level. 2 women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were killed within hours of each other. That night became known as the double event. The first body was found in Dupfield's yard. The second was found in Mitre Square, inside the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, while the earlier murders were mainly investigated by the Metropolitan Police. Now, 2 police forces were chasing one phantom through the same dark maze of streets. The public saw only chaos. The killer still had no face, no name, and no clear trail. He had struck twice in one night and escaped again. Then came the letters. In late September 1888, a message sent to the Central News Agency and later forwarded to police carried a mocking tone and a signature that would become immortal: Jack the Ripper. Historians still debate whether the letter was really from the killer or a hoax, but the effect was enormous. A murderer who had been a shadow now had a name the newspapers could print in giant letters. The legend was born almost instantly. From that moment, the murders became more than a police investigation. They became a media storm. Every rumor became a headline. Every man with blood on his shirt, every butcher, barber, doctor, foreigner, drunk, and loner could become a suspect by morning. Whitechapel was no longer just poor and frightened. It was under a fever of paranoia. And that was part of the killer's power. He was not just murdering women, he was humiliating the police, feeding the press, and teaching London a new kind of fear, the fear of an unknown predator who could be anyone, anywhere, and gone before the sun rose. After the double event, it felt as if the city itself had become his accomplice. Its fog, its alleys, its crowds, and its endless dark.